Taoiseach, 6 years ago this week, 31-year-old Nora Hyland died in Holles Street Hospital. She died from a cardiac arrest as a result of a massive haemorrhage after giving birth to her son Frederick by emergency caesarean. There were no emergency blood supplies in the operating theatre. The 37-minute delay in getting a transfusion, the coroner reckoned, probably cost her her life. This was a situation which Holles Street said they'd rectify, but although fridges were installed in theatres, they weren't sufficiently stocked when Malek Tawley bled to death in the same hospital in May 2016. 5 years ago yesterday, Sally Rowlett died in Sligo General Hospital, giving birth to her fourth child, as a result of a catastrophic mismanagement of HELP syndrome. The exact same condition and reason that Dara Kivlahan died in the same hospital a few years before. The HSE's brutal opposition to the truth coming out, fighting her husband Michael for 4 years and resisting that inquest, probably cost Sally Rowlett her life and her children their mother. Now, we're hearing a lot at the moment that Ireland is one of the safest countries to give birth. But when something goes wrong, there's no appetite for transparency. There's no appetite to learn. It's a battle every time, with the bereaved and stunned families on one side and the HSE lawyers on the other. Litigate, delay, deny. That's the HSE way. The report on Portiuncula still hasn't been released. Investigations were ongoing in 7 out of the 19 maternity hospitals last year. Twice in the last 3 years, the HSE has gone to court to prevent the truth coming out. Firstly, to prevent HIQA publishing the Portlaoise report, and now Holles Street effectively taking the Minister to court to stop an external investigation into Malek Tawley's death. Taoiseach, there is something very wrong in our health service. There were 27 maternal deaths between 2011 and 2013, but only 3 inquests. The culture of deny and defend has to end. You know, while I welcome the Minister's measure to have an external investigation, the reality is that mandatory maternal inquests for maternal deaths are a key step in ending this culture and improving maternity care. Now, this is something that this House has agreed on since my legislation was passed second stage in the dying days of the last Dáil. This was supposed to be, it was prioritised by the present Justice Committee. We gave the Department of Justice 6 months to table amendments. On the night before the committee hearing, they pulled the plug and didn't proceed with that investigation. This legislation is supposed to be a priority for your government, Taoiseach. Taoiseach, 2 years ago, you met Sean Rowlett, and he gave you a letter from his children where they said, "We miss our mam every day. Can you make sure this will never happen to another mam again?" Since that meeting, it's happened at least twice. Taoiseach, when are we going to see legislation for mandatory inquests in relation to maternal deaths?
Taoiseach to respond. The Taoiseach's 3 minutes.
Thank you. I think, first of all, I'd like once again to extend my condolences to the families of the women Deputy Daly mentions. And as you know, I've met some of those families when I was Minister for Health, and I know they still suffer every day from their loss and the traumatic events that occurred to them. And certainly my sympathies and those of the House are with them and their families. It is the case that Ireland is one of the safest countries in the world to give birth, both in terms of maternal mortality and neonatal mortality, but that should not give rise to any complacency in any way, because we need to make sure that the number of maternal deaths and neonatal deaths is minimised. It's never possible to eliminate them entirely, but they can be reduced further and minimised. Any time a maternal death does occur, there should be total transparency. Hospitals should be upfront about what happens, and should carry out full investigations so that lessons can be learned and further events avoided into the future. In terms of Mr Harris's actions, you'll know that he has sought an independent review of the Thawley case, and that's something and the government is totally behind him in that regard. And we're very disappointed and very dissatisfied that Holles Street has taken or threatening to take Mr Harris or the HSE to court to avoid an external inquiry. There should be an external inquiry rather than trying to block it, they should welcome it. If they have nothing to hide, they should certainly welcome it, and we're totally behind Minister Harris in that regard. Legislation was just passed in the last couple of months to provide for open disclosure. So for the first time, open disclosure by doctors and other healthcare professionals is protected. I know that was a long time coming, but has now been done, and now it's important that we turn that legal mechanism into a culture and a practice across our hospitals, whereby doctors and healthcare professionals are upfront with patients and their families when something goes wrong, and actually understand why it's in their interests to be upfront. And we know that that's the case for so many different reasons. In terms of inquests, that legislation is under consideration, and I know there are some very strong arguments in favour of mandatory inquests in the cases of all maternal deaths. But there may be cases where it's not appropriate. For example, where a family doesn't want an inquest. And we do have cases of maternal deaths, and it's known immediately why the mother died, and an inquest in those cases may not be necessary. But I think there is a very strong case for having them on a mandatory basis where the family requests.
Deputy Daly, you have 1 minute for supplementary.
I welcome the initiative taken by the Minister for Health to have an external review, but it's not enough, and it's not a substitute for an inquest. There are a lot of questions around that. What are the terms of reference? What are the qualifications of a reviewer? Will it be capable of public scrutiny? Taoiseach, there's something very wrong in the Department of Justice and Equality. I have to wonder sometimes, if men were dying, would we be waiting this long? Former Taoiseach Minister Fitzgerald and indeed Minister Flanagan have both guaranteed me that this legislation is a priority matter for them and their government. Objections like you raised about cases which are obvious, we've already dealt with them. It's a priority for the whole of the Justice Committee. County councils, the length and breadth of this country, for all parties and none, have supported this call. And yet the Department of Justice, who promised us that we would have this legislation through every stage before the summer, has not yet delivered a heads of bill on this. The Justice Committee, myself and Deputy O'Quailon have gone to meet them. Either they don't understand what priority is, or they're not listening to your ministers. There's no excuses for this. Babies have been conceived and delivered in the amount of time the Department of Justice told us that this would be seen through every stage. It's about fighting for better maternity care. We need this measure, and we need you to get behind forcing them to stop messing about on this and just deliver the legislation.
Yeah, the Minister for Health has already announced that all deaths in maternity hospitals will now be subject to an external review, and I think that's welcome, and I think that's very necessary. And it's also a provision of the National Maternity Strategy, which was published not too long ago. I'm advised by the Whip and by the Minister for Justice that this particular legislation is on the A-list, and the Minister for Justice intends to publish it this month. So if it is published this month, perhaps we can get it through the Houses sooner rather than later, but I have no doubt that the Deputy will hold us to account in that regard.
Deputy Eamon Ryan, 3 minutes for his question.